Everyone, welcome. We're glad to have you here with us. My name is Lindsay LaFerrier, and I'm a director at the Partnership for Public Service. We're excited to have you join us today as we dive into the findings from our latest report exploring what the public believes about the Trump administration's cuts to the federal government and how those cuts could impact individuals, communities, and the nation as a whole. Since taking office in January, the second Trump administration has moved quickly to make substantial and somewhat arbitrary cuts to the federal government. These actions are ending government programs, canceling contracts and grants, and laying off thousands of federal workers. In the midst of all this turmoil, the partnership wanted to understand how the public is viewing the cuts and what could be done to effectively communicate about their impact. So to talk about our research and our findings, I'm now going to turn it over to Paul Hitlin, who leads our public perception research here at the partnership. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, we encourage you to drop them into the chat. We'll have time at the end. We'll also have an opportunity for folks who would like to come off mute and share their questions verbally as well. So with that, Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I guess it is technically afternoon for those of us on the East Coast, so good afternoon. I'm going to give a presentation for a little bit about some of our work, and you should be able to see it. So what we're going to talk about today is the public perceptions of these federal cutbacks that Lindsay mentioned, and I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. So the agenda is I'm going to talk for a little bit about how the public views the recent changes to the federal government. We're going to focus a little bit on something that the partnership is particularly interested in, is what is it that supporters of these cuts and these changes believe. We're going to then give a few recommendations on some of the ways to talk about how the federal government works. This is something that we're actively working on ourselves. And then we're going to leave a lot of time for a Q&A or discussion. Very interested in what people have to say and answering questions if we can. So, as I said, we're going to focus a lot on how the public views the recent changes. All the data you're going to see here is available in a recent report that we published called Mad Money. And we'll make sure that we share the link to that in the chat. I learned that people under the age of 30 don't get the Mad Money reference. They thought it was a Bad Bunny reference. So that's one thing I learned. But that report has all this and more. So I encourage you to go check that out after we do this. So our data comes from what we're going to talk about today comes from a nationally representative survey that was conducted basically at the beginning of April this year. So it is a few months ago, of 800 adults. The margin of error was 3.5 points. We conducted it in English and Spanish. And again, to emphasize, it is nationally representative. So the two main takeaways, the cuts to the federal government are generally unpopular. And as may not be a surprise, there are major differences in view by party affiliation. So to dive into this a little more specific, when you ask people just flat out, do you support or oppose the changes made by the Trump administration? 39% say they support, 49% say they oppose, and 12% say they don't know. And as you might expect, Democrats overwhelmingly oppose, Republicans overwhelmingly support, and independents by about a 2-to-1 say they oppose it, although 37% said they were unsure, which is a theme we've seen recently. A lot of independents are unsure in a lot of survey answers. We also asked this sort of a similar question using different terminology. So we asked, do you support or oppose funding cuts and layoffs? And you get virtually the identical reports, responses. The numbers are almost identical. So the way you describe it or the way you ask the question doesn't seem to make much of a difference. And we wanted to dig in more what people thought and what they think about the consequences and potential. So as I said, generally people are opposed or concerned about the cuts. 55% said the cuts will hurt the U.S. economy. 31% disagreed with that. 14% didn't know. 52% said they thought the cuts would make the country less safe. 49% said they thought air travel would be less safe. Only 30% disagree with that. And 44% thought that the measles and bird flu outbreaks would be made worse. That was something that was heavily in the news at the time we did the survey. I guess it's still in the news some, but it was a big deal, especially when we did our survey. And we just asked directly, do you think that these cuts are going to make your life better or worse? And 50% thought it would make their community worse. Only 28% thought it would be better. 21% said they didn't know. And their life, 45% said worse, 30% said better, and 24% don't know. Um, which services or areas were people most concerned about? We asked people to pick up to three, and by far the biggest concern was the delivery of benefits, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits. As you can see, more than half of our respondents selected that as one of their top concerns. Other things like disease research, food safety, veterans healthcare and benefits, a lot of people selected as well. But by far, delivery of benefits was the top concern. Another thing we wanted to see is how are people recognizing what's going, the cuts and how it connects with their lives. And so we asked, do you know anyone who's been impacted by these cuts? And again, this was a few months ago. 12% of people said they had been impacted by the cuts, and another 23% said they knew somebody who'd been impacted by the cuts. So combined, that's 35%. That's a third of the country saying that they or someone they know have been impacted by the cuts, which to me is a large number. That's 100 million plus people. And that's suggesting that this isn't just an inside the Beltway story. People, at least large numbers of people, are making connections about how these cuts are affecting things around them, and seeing that. And over time, that number may grow, but that's where it was when we conducted our survey. Uh, who are what are the demographics or the type of people who support the cuts? As I mentioned before, Republicans overwhelmingly support them. The numbers you see there are the top ones are the same ones we showed before. Whites a bit more likely to support. 44% said they support than Hispanics or African Americans. An unusual thing by age, the 35 to 49-year-old group was less likely to support than the other age groups. And to be honest, I don't think we know exactly why that is. Something we want to dig into further to see a difference like that. And then by education, there were some small differences. People that did not have a college degree, 40% supported. College graduates, 36%, and 32% of people who have an advanced degree. So a slight difference there by education. And what do these supporters believe? Why are they supporting these efforts? We wanted to really dig into that and get an understanding of that. And this to me was by far the biggest thing we found, both in our survey and also some focus groups we ran, which is there's a really strong support or belief among the people who support these cuts that the reductions will result in tangible cost savings for the American taxpayer. So we asked, how much savings do you think will be created for taxpayers? 81% of the people who say they support the cuts believe that there will be a lot or some savings for taxpayers. Only 12% of those said there wouldn't be much. So it's a really strong belief that the cuts will be enough that people will benefit from them. And whether that would be a refund or taxes or cutting the budget overall and other impacts, a whole host of possibilities there. But there's a really strong belief that the amount of cuts would make a difference that people would notice. And I think there's a lot of question about how much is being cut and how much of the budget that is. We'll save that for another time. But this is a really strongly held belief by those who support what the administration is doing. And to look at some of the questions we talked about earlier, we divided them up by who supports the cuts and who opposes. So among people who support the cuts, as you might expect, most of them think the cuts will make their lives better. 62% said that the community will be made better, but 16% said worse, and 22% said they didn't know. So that's 38% of people who support the cuts. We're not sure whether it's going to make their life better or not. When you ask about their life, 67% support. So what we found here, and we also found again in some of our focus groups, is that there was a lot of uncertainty, even among people that support it. There's a lot of let's wait and see what happens. We don't exactly know what the impacts will be. And there's a large amount of people, even some people that were very much into it, who said that they thought there might be some hiccups and problems, but they still thought it was worth it overall. And two things that we found in again our surveys, but also our focus groups, supporters of these cuts, there's a lot of trust in Trump and his administration to find the right balance. There was a lot of people who said, yeah, there may be hiccups, there may be some things that go wrong or some things that cut that shouldn't be, but the administration will figure that out, they'll fix it, and they'll balance it out. We heard that type of concept a lot. And so while the folks here didn't necessarily trust the government a lot, there did seem to be a lot of trust in Trump individually and his administration. And something else we heard a fair amount is that Donald Trump and his administration is an instrument to combat government spending that has gotten out of control. There was a view that spending and everything's just gotten too large, and so you need a force or person or something to come in and combat that. And so even if it's not done perfectly or whatever, the belief is that Trump, there's a lot of belief that Trump is the person to do that, or ultimately what he will do will be beneficial. Another important point, just slightly different, but supporters of the cuts and in the public as overall, they're not interested in a partisan civil service. So those of you who've been paying attention, I know at one point it was called Schedule F. There's other names for that sort of idea now to politicize perhaps some of the civil service. You do not see a lot of support for that, even among people who are in favor of the administration's cuts. So specifically, among people who support the cuts, 76% said that civil servants should be apolitical, which is actually more than those who oppose the cuts. 72% agree that a nonpartisan civil service is important for democracy. And 83% said that an expert and non-political federal workforce is critical to our country's well-being. Again, that's actually higher than the people who oppose the cuts. So just to make that connection a little clearer, the people who are supporting these cuts are not supporting it because they want to see a politicized civil service. That's not why they support it. It really is about cutting spending and certainly waste and fraud, as they like to focus on. It's not about putting in a civil service that is political in nature. And now into a different area that is something the partnership's really interested in, we're working on, and is how do we talk about the impacts of federal cuts? So we have a few tips that I'll go through now, and very interested if other people have ideas on this. And it's something that, again, we're going to continue to work on and try and make more recommendations. But a few things that we've discovered. First off, it's really important to talk about the impact of the government on families, communities, and the American people. This may seem obvious, but when you talk to people about how they will be impacted, what the effects of cuts will be, it's much better received than if you talk about how many people were cut or laid off, or what it means for certain agencies. To really focus on what these agencies do and the impact on people. That's far more, it's going to be received far more well than if you focus on the inside baseball part of it, so to speak. We've found a lot of success when you tell stories of individual civil servants and their great work. Many of you may know the partnership does awards every year called the Sammy Awards, where we highlight individual civil servants who do great work. The responses to that, along with some of the responses to things in our focus groups, are just really positive. People are really interested in seeing about individual civil servants. And what we found is that people, in a good way, often generalize when they learn about a particular person who's done really great work. It makes them think, oh, there are other people in the government who are doing great work. And in a couple cases, we've heard people say that, just volunteer that idea that, oh, making me see this person makes me think that there's probably a lot more like them, rather than thinking that that individual is the exception. And so that's something that we found to be effective. Focus on national security and issues with broad support like food safety and national parks. National security and safety is a big word, and that can not just be national security, but can be like food safety, economic safety, health, other types of things. Those types of things get received well. Simple, practical, and common sense reforms, really emphasizing common sense and things that are straightforward, seems to work better. And it is helpful to acknowledge that people understandably have doubts and distrust about government. To acknowledge that helps people hear other things a little bit better. Don't use a lot of data when you're talking about the federal government. It's true about a lot of things. Data, I wish it did, but data doesn't always convince people. Or acronyms. It's easy to forget, those of us in the DC world, it's easy to forget that most people don't know what OPM is or other acronyms like that. So make sure that when you're talking about the government, you don't get caught up in those acronyms, and sort of use layman's talk as best as you can. As I said earlier, don't focus on the federal employees in DC who are losing their jobs necessarily. Talk about the impact of those jobs losses. Um, we found through our focus groups that there's not a lot of sympathy for civil servants losing their jobs. There's a lot of people who say, well, that happens in the real world, it happens in the business world, so federal employees losing their jobs, that's just what happens. So it's beneficial to not necessarily focus on that element and to focus really on the impact of what those cuts will be. Don't use vague and alarmist language. There's some research that shows that people sometimes get turned off by alarmist language. So again, thinking about practical things and common sense solutions, less so than saying the rule of law is ending or some, overly or dramatic things like that. Don't necessarily focus on innovation. We know that people want their government to be reliable and trusted more than innovative. It doesn't mean government shouldn't be innovative. We're just talking about communicating at this point. And obviously, we know that for a government to be reliable and trusted, it does need to be innovative. So I'm definitely not suggesting the government shouldn't be innovative. But when you're talking about it, we know that the public wants their government to be reliable, especially in times of crisis, and trusted. And dependable. That's what they really want more than hearing about innovative things. And lastly, don't use stock footage. People recognize stock footage, and they don't react well to it. In fact, we had some people, particularly younger folks, who were really turned off by the use of stock images. So I know it's hard, but whenever you can, it's better to use real pictures and things like that. So I'm almost done. I'm going to turn it back to Lindsay. I'll just say briefly what's next for the partnership. We're going to be releasing another report in a couple of weeks that looks at trust in the government in the context of the last few years. We've been doing this work for about 5 years. So looking at that from a bigger picture standpoint. And the organization, we're doing a lot of work, and we'll be releasing some resources in the coming weeks that focus on where cuts are happening and what those impacts of those cuts are to individuals and communities. There's a lot of work going on, and again, and we'll be releasing some of that. If you're interested in learning more info about that now, or even coordinate or helping on that, contact Lindsay. I know we're eager to chat about that. So I'm going to stop talking now and stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Lindsay, if that's okay, and then we can do a Q&A from there.
So really encourage folks to drop any questions in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to ask a question verbally. I do have a couple of questions that I'll start with that were in the chat. So the first is, since the data is a few months old, do you have any takeaways of what might have changed recently or how these results are still relevant now and into the future?
So that's an excellent question. Before I get to that, just a moment of logistics. If you have questions, please either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and we'll call on people as we see their hands raised. If we call on you, please feel free to come off of mute and ask your question. Please, we request if you haven't been called on to stay on mute. It just makes it cleaner and easier to people to hear. The question is a very good one. Obviously, anybody who does surveys will tell you that any given survey is a moment in time, and should be considered that way. I would say so the real answer is we don't 100% know for sure. There's a lot of indication that from a political standpoint, both in some of our work and other polls by other organizations, that these changes continue to be unpopular and maybe slightly growing less popular. We know that, for example, Elon Musk as an individual became very unpopular. We don't know. We expect probably that the impacts, more people will see them over time. And that's something that we're going to continue to try and look at and get more data on. But as the researcher in me, I can't say that with certainty. So admittedly, news there are new things happening literally every day, and how those things impact are hard to know. Um, so I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's where we are, and trying the best to keep up with things as we can. Um,
I have
I'm looking
more
for the
questions in the chat.
yes.
So, can you talk more about distrust of institutions like universities and science and the related cuts?
So um, I'm not an expert on trusted institutions in general, other than I know that trusted institutions has been declining for decades. Um, uh, I know that when it comes to education, there are some partisan differences in there. Um, Unfortunately, I don't know. We haven't asked a lot specifically about science, and those cuts. We did have, in the list of things that we asked what people were most concerned about. We did have some research and health funding, which wasn't among the highest, but was there. So unfortunately, I don't know that I can answer much more than that. Lindsay, or if anyone else has ideas, I'd love to hear that, and maybe can
So,
share that.
as Paul shared, the partnerships focused on trust in the federal government, and the federal government's where our mission is focused. But when you look at some of the phenomenon that Paul talked about in the research, where there's kind of a distrust of something globally. So when you talk about firing civil servants as a whole, as opposed to getting specific. So if you're talking about a cut to funding research at a university, you're going to be much more successful if you talk about what was that research doing, who is that research supporting, than talking about Harvard's no longer getting millions of dollars. Like being able to show where was that money going and why is that harmful to people that it no longer exists is the much more successful message than if you're focusing on the amount of money to an institution as the key point. Um, Lots of questions in the chat, so I'm going to jump right in, Paul. For the don't know responses, were there any follow-up or free text response options? Additionally, was occupation captured by the survey or in the focus groups?
So we did not capture occupation, unfortunately, although when you're talking about an 800-person survey, it's hard to get enough of specific groups to make statistical significant findings on that. In some of the questions we allowed for free text responses, not all. Um, I will say, I think we were a little, just to be honest, a little surprised at the number of don't knows that we got. Traditionally, in our previous surveys and surveys for other organizations, you might get 1% don't know or 5% don't know. There are perhaps some methodological reasons, or maybe that independents are less opinionated or mixed. I mean, there's lots of theories out there. Um, so that's one of the many things that we're interested in looking at, um, uh, is to understand why that it was such a large number at this point. Um, we There's a couple options, and we would like to know which ones we think that is. Um, I see at least one hand raised, and there's more in the chat. Do we want to keep going to the chat, maybe, and then get to Drew?
Sure. How did you come up with the recommendations? I assume they're talking about the do's and don'ts focus groups.
It's a mix. So some of it is from are definitely some focus groups work that we've done, definitely some survey work that we've done through the last few years, asking certain questions. We did some online focus groups, and qual boards was a technique we used a couple years ago. And some of it is from recommendations that from other organizations that we've seen. And some of it comes from basically the partnership storytelling experience. We've been doing a lot of work for years on trying to tell stories. So it's a mix of things. Um, uh, it's not necessarily from one place. Can we receive a copy of the presentation? I imagine we could do that. Is there any reason we can't do that?
And most of the charts that Paul used in this are in the report that I linked to earlier, so you can find all of that in there as well. Um, are there any plans for the partnership to follow up with future focus groups and data?
So Lindsay may be able to speak to some of this. The answer is yes. We definitely will continue studying these areas. I think, like a lot of places, we're trying to figure out how best to devote our resources and where we can have the biggest impact. But we absolutely are planning on continuing this work. Lindsay, is there anything else we should say along those lines?
No, just stay tuned. We'll release at least one more kind of research product later this year where we'll have a chance to, like Drew, you were asking, update some of the survey research to see how 6, 7 months into the administration some of this changed as folks are seeing more cuts. Do you want to pause now, Paul, and get to some folks who have their hand raised, and then we'll come back to the questions in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Delaney, for sharing the polls that you found. That's really great to see that. Drew, I know your hand is up. It's been a while, so please come off mute and let us know what you're wondering or want to share.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. This is Drew. I'm a reporter with Federal News Network. I was really interested in the results that you had when you asked people about like a non-political civil service and policies like Schedule F. And I was just curious because on the other parts of the survey, you said you would test a different language of like funding cuts versus layoffs and gotten the same results. So I was kind of wondering, what was the language or the way that you phrased the idea of a non-political civil service? And did you get different responses based on the language that you used for that?
Uh, so very good question, and I will say that as part of the report that will be coming out in a couple of weeks, we'll dive into this even more. But we did ask several ways. You may have seen a couple of the terms, so apolitical, nonpartisan. Is it good for the country, good for the democracy? So we did ask that similar concept a number of different ways, and um, the responses were generally pretty similar in sort of 75 to 85 in that range, maybe some small differences, but generally there's widespread support among the country for a non-political, apolitical civil servant. Obviously, some words like apolitical, we're not sure that everyone necessarily knows what that means or has the same definition. So that's a reason why we ask different ways. But what we found is again different terms come up with pretty similar responses there. So, Heather.
Yes, sorry about the delay. I had to find the unmute button. So my question is related to the questions that were asked do not show the level of understanding of what is going on really. The trickle down effect is of these cuts to federal government, the slash and burn kind of approach, is not understood by the general public. USA, USAID, they get it. People do not understand that by cutting my department in patient safety has cut a lot of state jobs, a lot of state programs, a lot of state funded resources that that haven't been recognized. But then it'll happen to somebody else who's in a different industry, and then somebody will come back to me and say, "Oh, I see what you're saying." And then, like for instance, the internet program or the fiber to the premises for rural areas program that was cut has affected other people that I know of, and all of a sudden a whole new group of people seem to be aware of what this is going on. So how do you communicate that. And I will say the Federal News Network is the one that I actually trust to communicate those things. And it would be great if the partnership could also embrace that idea that the man on the street does not get it.
Well, so thank you for sharing that and sharing those examples. I'll start, and again, Lindsay, maybe ask for you to add to that. This is sort of been a universal problem for both the federal government and the Partnership for Public Service for many years. While we didn't dive into it a lot in this specific survey, we know from plenty of other surveys and work that people don't really know a lot of specifics about the federal government. They don't necessarily know what's the difference between a political appointee and a non-political appointee, what many agencies do. There's not a lot of specific knowledge. And so obviously when you're talking about cuts, the similar lack of specificity is going to be an issue. I think we as an organization are trying. A lot of the work we are doing and will continue to do is to try and help find ways to publicize that message. It's sort of the $1 million or $1 billion question or whatever. How do you get attention to that? It's really hard. And it's definitely something that we've been trying to do, and it's even more important now than ever. Lindsay, please add whatever you want to.
Yeah, just like Paul said, I mean, since we started studying these issues 5 years ago, it's very clear that most people don't know what the federal government does for them. And that's even more critical now when we're talking about things being cut. So we would encourage you, like you all have networks of agency or from a service that you are now experiencing much longer wait times for. All of that is important because we need to get outside of the national media bubble or get into new spaces. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we hope some of this research can help folks think about what are the most effective things to discuss.
Could I follow up with one quick thing?
Please.
Sure. And we have a lot of other questions, so sorry, but we gotta move on.
This is very, very quick. You have a perfect example in the vice president. The vice president would not be where he is if it wasn't for the services provided. And I would capitalize on that in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. So
in a story. So that's all I had to say.
Yeah. So the partnership is nonpartisan. So we are a lot more focused on what does this mean for other families? How do we make this as local for people as possible? So how can they see how it will impact them? Not so much as it impacts people, but thank you for that feedback. The next question, Paul, is a technical one. Where is the sample coming from in regards to participants of the survey? How is the demographic broken down?
So this is a nationally representative survey. So that means that the respondents were contacted at random, and then the data was weighted to reflect the population of the US. So the results are weighted against census data, which is sort of the best available data as how the country is made up. So in terms of gender, race, income, education, it is representative of the country. It's as representative as is possible. The margin of error is 3.5 points, and that's because obviously there's going to be a little bit of give or take, but it is a nationally representative sample, which is good and also challenging. So the demographics would break down like you would see in the country, so about 50-50 for gender, et cetera. I can read the next. Are some programs raising
There's a bunch more, but I have a whole list.
Okay, why don't you do that rather than me?
Are some programs raising more concerns and pushback from the public and the media? For example, Veterans Health, Head Start, cancer research, etc.
So the media moves around quickly. I think there's no question that Social Security has been a pretty highlighted story. I think a lot of things in a previous life, I studied media a little bit. A lot of things, unfortunately, get covered when there's a crisis. So FEMA got a lot of attention after the terrible floods in Texas. The FAA got some attention when there were some crashes and some near misses. So that's often how the media thinks of things. It's sort of episodic and based a lot on the current crisis. I think what we hope to do and hope to help others is to raise awareness about a lot of the impacts of the cuts and how wide they are, or the impact of them are. And so it's not just after a crisis, it's hopefully helping to prevent some crisis. Um, yeah, let me stop there on that.
We did ask a question in the survey around where were the areas where people were most concerned about the impacts. So Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid was the highest, 52%, and then it was followed by disease research and prevention, food safety, and veterans healthcare and benefits. So if you're looking for what are the types of stories that people are already concerned about, that there may be an appetite to learn what's happening, those are good ones to start with. Okay.
Thank you, Chris, for your nice note. I appreciate that.
Did any of the questions address concerns with emergency response and FEMA? I'm very concerned about response to future emergencies.
So we included disaster response as one of the areas where people are concerned, and I believe it was 17%, give or take. We didn't ask more specifically about that. I understand your concern, but I don't think we have necessarily data more specifically on FEMA. It's definitely one of the clear areas where the federal government is visible and seen. There's a political conversation about the role of FEMA, of course, but unfortunately, we didn't dive too much more into emergency response, although clearly that's a really important area. Thank you, Allison, for your nice note as well. I'll just keep thanking that.
Have you asked questions about the degree to which people who voted for Trump are shifting their opinion now that he is in office, and are they seeing his actions and as they are seeing his actions in the federal government?
So we have not really jumped into that. As Lindsay said, we're a nonpartisan organization and we tend to try and stay away from politics. I will say that one of the reasons we started doing this work is because we saw there was a gap, so to speak, in the area. There are a lot of organizations that do ask political questions and then ask, do you trust the government? But the frame that they generally use is the political frame, who might you vote for, et cetera. There's very little research that's been done on the impact on agencies and the services that government provided. So we've been focusing on that area for a lot of reasons. That's our mission as a partnership, but also because it's an area that I think is less examined than some of the political things. I know that there's some other organizations, news organizations, whatever, doing some of that, but we have not really jumped into that area.
Someone asked, were there any questions related to where people are getting their information about the cuts to the federal workforce, social media, mainstream media, or word of mouth?
We've asked that in previous surveys. We did not. I have to double check. I'm pretty sure we did not ask that at this survey. What we've asked in the past is a lot of people say social media, a lot of people say friends and family. It does differ by age. I will say it's a challenge to understand where they say they get their information and where they actually get their information may not always be the same. So if someone sees something on social media from their uncle, are they saying, "Oh, I'm getting it from social media," or am I getting it from my uncle? So it's that, and then people hear things and don't always remember where they get it. Anyway, it's really important. It's something that I'm fascinated by. Unfortunately, we don't have hard data on that from this current year.
Okay. And then I have one more question. So if anyone else has final questions, I think we have 5 more minutes here. We often hear a lot about government employee cuts, but there's less discussion about contractor layoffs and the broader cascading impacts that these can have on agencies and communities. Discussions also tend to focus on cuts in DC, even though most federal employees actually work outside the Beltway, something that many people may not realize. But asking questions about these dynamics help prompt a more informed conversation.
So I think you're absolutely right. There's been very little focus on contractors and the role that they play. I think that's exactly right. Um, One of the facts that we like to share at the partnership, that surprises a lot of people, is that 80% of federal employees do not live in the DMV area. They live out the rest of the country. That's one of the misconceptions that we know is pretty strong around the country. Um, when you ask people about government, they think politics. They think about Congress, they think about the White House. Um, they don't think about federal agencies, and even when you do ask about federal agencies, there is a lot of focus on the people in DC, and that is, getting people to understand that the federal government does things beyond that, and that there are lots of different types of jobs and lots of different ways the federal government impacts peoples and delivers services is one of the goals that we have as an organization. It's definitely a misconception or a fact that needs to be promoted more.
I'll just say from the question design standpoint, we know from doing this work for 5 years that people don't know about the number of contractors in government and they don't know about Fed. So we have not been asking that question because we know it's a problem. The task in front of us collectively now is how do we help people see the role that government has in their communities? So even without asking the question, we know it's a problem. What can we do with that information to make sure that people are seeing how these cuts are going to show up in their lives or maybe already have? Paul, you may say this. When is the next data collection being done? It seems the public perception is not just POTUS changes weekly, monthly. Could be done again soon.
So we have plans to do some different types of surveys the rest of this year. And like I said, we have a big report coming out that's based on a similar survey, but looks at different components of it. We want to continue doing this work. As I said before, everyone's trying to figure out where resources are going to be the most effective. But we definitely will be doing some online surveys, some other things in the coming months. So if you're not on our mailing list, this will be a good plug to get on our mailing list so that you get those things as soon as we publish them. And if there are other organizations or that are doing this work, we'd love to chat about it and maybe even collaborate. That's something that we're very eager to do as well.
There was a question.
Yeah.
How do you address the fear people have in answering questions?
Interesting. So I theoretically, people are answering a survey, they're answering online, they may be contacted by a cell phone, but they're answering online. I don't know that there's been a lot of thought about, I think the general in the polling industry, the general feeling is that people are fairly honest when they're answering something online and it's not a political thing. I think that's an interesting question are people concerned where their answers are going to go? It is all anonymized and people don't give their name or anything like that. But it's an interesting question if people are concerned about that information. I haven't thought much about that. I know the polling world is very focused on lots of things that may be something else they need to think about. Yeah, I don't have anything else wise to say about that.
Yeah. I just think that that's why it's important that we have a vendor that we work with on this who has expertise and does this every day and has figured out how did they do that in a way that's going to make people feel secure and get access to folks.
So I think we're about out of time. I'll just wrap up by saying please check out our report and please, I think if we haven't already, we'll put our emails in the chat. Please, if you have questions, ideas, ways to collaborate, please feel free to reach out to Lindsay and or myself. We are very eager to continue this work and bring lots of good voices and good minds into this. So don't hesitate at all. Please reach out with further questions and ideas. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. And stay tuned because the partnership is very much. Is my background backwards? I don't know if I realized that. No. Okay. Anyway, sorry, got distracted. Keep the partnership. We're going to be releasing some new resources in the coming weeks and months. So also stay tuned for that. Thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Take care.